Let's just get this straight. The Democrats are lying to you. Hey everyone, this is Kristan Hawkins. Welcome to Explicitly Pro-Life. Thanks for tuning in. So today I want to talk a little bit about what's going on that you're going to be hearing kind of in this election of this constitutional right to abortion, that women have a constitutional right to abortion, that Roe v. Wade is a constitutional law. We're going to talk today about why Roe v. Wade is illegitimate and was illegitimate from the very beginning, from January 1973. And I want to go over just 4 reasons why this decision was so poorly decided and quite honestly reasoned. As you know, 7 men in January of 1973 handed down Roe v. Wade and Doe versus Bolton, the companion case to Roe. Sometimes when you're talking about abortion, even I saw a poll a couple years ago, Gallup had done a poll on abortion, and they said, as you know, Roe allows for abortion the first 3 months of pregnancy, and they failed to put into that poll that Doe versus Bolton, the companion case released the exact same day, actually allows for abortion all 9 months of pregnancy. So that's actually a really important just talking point when you're speaking to people, educating others about the legality of abortion, to say Roe and Doe. And it's something that we're kind of conscious of at Students for Life. A lot of times I'll say Roe and Doe. So 7 men, which by the way, no one had a problem then that 7 men talked about abortion. Now, if it was 7 men who decided to reverse Roe versus Wade, there would be a holy war in Washington, D.C. that goes on. So 7 men, 7 white men, decided to hand down Roe v. Wade in January 1973. It was thought at the time that this was going to settle the abortion debate. That couldn't have been further from the truth. In fact, polls going into that decision handed down by the court showed that the majority of Americans weren't in favor of abortion. Now, polls started to change after the Supreme Court weighed in on abortion, which is why when a lot of times we talk in the pro-life movement, but sadly, a lot of people derive morality from legality, that once something is made legal, they then think it's okay to do. And this is why, you just can't change people's hearts and work towards making abortion unthinkable. You also have to work towards making abortion illegal. We believe that those two things go hand in hand. While you want to make sure you're serving women and meeting every need she has in that moment of an unplanned crisis pregnancy, you want to make sure she knows she never has to make that false choice between the life of her child and her future, her education, her career. You also have to work to make it illegal, because until abortion's made illegal, there will always be a segment of people that think it's morally okay, because sadly, those people derive their morality from legality, which, as you know, is a very slippery slope, because the Supreme Court has been wrong many times in the past. They've overturned themselves more than 236 times. You've got the Plessy versus Ferguson case, where they upheld segregation of schools. You have the Dred Scott decision, where the court, said that, yes, African-American men weren't full men. There were 3/5 of a person. In fact, you still have the Bell decision, which never has been reversed, that says that states have the right to practice eugenics and forcibly sterilize other people. That decision's never even been reversed. And still to this day, I get hate emails from people at my Students for Life account who will literally still try to make that argument that forcibly sterilizing certain people because of the color of their skin, because of their IQ, because of how much money's in their bank account is somehow okay to do. It's not, okay? So as we go into this 2020 election, you're going to hear, and I've already heard several times, Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, who's trying to, market herself as the sole defender of abortion rights on the campaign trail. You're going to hear this: abortion is a constitutional right. Abortion is a constitutional right. We have to protect the constitutional right of abortion. But it's not a constitutional right. In fact, the suit, the decision, Roe v. Wade versus Bolton, is, quite frankly, it's crap. And it's illegitimate. First, it's illegitimate because the attorneys for Jane Roe, we know Norma McCorvey, who later in life became a pro-life activist, Sarah Weddington and the other attorneys for Jane Roe used fake statistics and testimony in order to make the abortion situation seem worse than it really was. For example, NARAL, Pro-Choice America co-founder, Dr. Bernard Nathanson, by the way, NARAL Pro-Choice America was founded by two men. Bernard Nathanson, we've talked about this before, a former abortionist who was committing abortions in New York State where it was legal. And then Larry Ladder, who was a biographer of Margaret Sanger and a firm eugenicist believer in a 1970s impending population bomb. He was ED of the Hugh Moore Fund, who came to believe abortion as a way to prevent mass starvation because he thought in the 1970s was going to have this worldwide famine. So these two men who founded NARAL, they actually advanced the lie that there were about 10,000, they were advancing the lie there was about 1 million abortions had taken place in the United States, when really Nathanson later came out and said it was probably 10,000. They also are responsible for advancing the lie that they were saying 10,000 women a year were dying from illegal, back alley, dangerous abortions. Bernard Nathanson later came out and said that was a lie. In fact, we know that was a lie because if you look at Planned Parenthood's own medical director, Mary Calderon, in 1958-59, at a medical conference, estimated the amount of abortion deaths to being fewer than 500 women a year. And she actually talked about, the invention of penicillin as the reason why this number was so low, because the majority of women who were dying from illegal abortions were dying of sepsis because parts, especially before ultrasound guided technology, parts of the baby, parts of the placenta are being left inside of the woman. And it was causing infection. So you have Christopher Tietz, who was a kind of statistician who actually received one of Planned Parenthood's highest awards in the 1970s. In 1965, he came out and said that the number of women dying from illegal abortions was about 500 a year. You have the Center for Disease Control, the CDC, in the 1970s reported the number of deaths that they knew of from illegal and legal abortions. Because remember, before 1973, several states had already legalized abortion: California, Hawaii, Colorado, New York State. And so their estimates of illegal and legal abortion deaths was fewer than 100 a year starting in 1970. And they actually go through year by year. So this was, first of all, a lie. So this kind of number that was given to the American people to have sympathy of, look, we don't want women dying of back alley abortions. This number was just wrong. We also know that myth of the back alley abortion is, for the most part, very wrong. Once again, Mary Calderon, Planned Parenthood's medical director in 1960 or 62, came out and said that 90% of abortions were being performed, were being committed by physicians in good standing in their community. They just couldn't put a sign outside their door, couldn't put an ad in the white pages saying they committed abortions. The second kind of thing we heard for the justification of Roe versus Wade is also false, was that the truth about Norma McCorvey's story, her circumstances, Jane Roe, were actually manipulated to gain sympathy. Norma McCorvey, who in the late mid-90s became a Christian, became pro-life, spoke openly about this in her testimony. We know that the attorneys got Norma to falsely claim that she was gang raped, when in reality she was not. She didn't even go to the attorneys looking for an abortion. She was pregnant and she was looking for a divorce. They basically co-opted her story for the abortion case. She never even had an abortion. The child she was pregnant with at the time was placed into an adoptive family. But just like what we saw with Alabama this spring, the abortion lobby is very good with using the very real trauma and pain of sexual assault, of rape, to manipulate America and manipulate Americans into supporting the killing of preborn children. You can't have an honest discussion about abortion today, even on a college campus or out in the community, without sexual assault being brought up. In reality, the numbers of children who are killed because they were conceived and raped because their father is a rapist is very low. It's only about 1% of all abortions are committed because of pregnancy resulting from sexual assault. Yet that 1% is used to justify 99% of other abortions. I often use when I'm talking on college campuses, if I'm having a discussion with somebody, not if I'm in a larger venue and I only have a few seconds, but if I'm having a discussion with someone, I'll try to get them to the point of saying, okay, you disagree with me about abortion cases of rape and incest. You believe that certain fetal abnormalities or deformities. You believe my children, for example, who have cystic fibrosis, I should have the right to kill them simply because of their DNA. Okay, let's set aside those cases. So let's set aside those 3% of all abortion cases. Will you join me? Will you join me in saying that 97% of all the other abortions shouldn't be allowed? And it's fascinating because I think I've only gotten one person who's been that staunch abortion supporter to go there, right? Of saying, oh yeah, most of the time they realize that they've been into a trap, and then they've gotten themselves in a hole, and then they kind of just walk away. They don't really want to have that discussion because at the end of the day, what we see over and over again, the abortion lobby and those who support abortion use rape, use sexual assault, use these sad stories to justify all abortions. And even if you give that 3% to them, they're still not going to join with you because they still don't agree with you. Why? It's the same reason why they're in favor of those 3% abortions. Because at the end of the day, they don't actually agree with you that the preborn child is a unique, whole, living human being that's never existed before and will never exist again. That's always, no matter, and I've talked about this before, fundamentally, at the end of the day, no matter what you're arguing about when it comes to abortion, the discussion is always going to come to that. Okay, so now we have two reasons. So we have this faulty reasoning for the number of abortions. That was used for why Roe v. Wade was needed. You had this story of Norma McCorvey that was made up. The third reason that this decision, Roe v. Wade, is illegitimate and wrongly decided, is that it's just bad law. It's actually just bad law. So last summer in the Washington Post, Megan McArdle wrote, I myself am uneasily pro-choice. So she's like that mushy middle, like, I don't like abortion, but I shouldn't tell someone not to have one, whatever. We deal with that all the time. But she said, I'd be glad to see Roe go as quickly as possible. The decision itself is a poorly reasoned mess. It failed to mount a convincing case that the Constitution contains language that can be read as guaranteeing a woman's right to abort her pregnancy. It's just bad law. In fact, I was reading this morning just some history of abortion law in our country and actually throughout the world. And there was a really well-known pro-abortion rights judicial scholar who actually right after Roe wrote in the Yale Law Review that this case, Roe was decided on no constitutional standing, that they literally just made this case up. I'm actually looking for it's a man's name. Here we go. Yeah. John Hart Ely. He criticized Roe as a decision that is not constitutional law and gives almost no sense of an obligation to try to be. This was in the Yale Law Journal shortly after Roe was decided. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the great hero for the pro-abortion movement, she's openly defended abortion in all 9 months for whatever reason. If you ever want to read evil, read her dissent in the Gonzalez v. Planned Parenthood case in 2007. I remember when that case came down. I was sitting at the Students for Life, our first office, which we were in for 3 years, which had no windows. I spent multiple hours there and days without seeing the sun. I remember when that decision came down. I read the opinion from the court, and what happened in this Gonzalez v. Carhart and Gonzalez v. Planned Parenthood case was the court basically upheld partial birth abortion bans in states. There were two cases that they looked at. Alberto Gonzalez was the United States Attorney General. So Carhart, the infamous late-term abortionist who's still committing, Leroy Carhart, still committing abortions today in Maryland and Nebraska, was one of the folks who brought the suit, and then Planned Parenthood, shock, was the other. And so these decisions were handed down the same day. The court, it was a pretty big decision where this was the first time the court recognized the gruesomeness of the abortion procedure. And actually in the decision, they actually talked about how horrific a partial birth abortion is. They talked about how it's never, this type of procedure is never needed. My friends at Operation Outcry had submitted testimony of women and men who had experienced abortion, talk about how abortion hurt them. It was actually, their testimony was actually cited, how all of these women and men have come forward regretting their abortion. So that was actually, it was a really big case. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, of course, led the dissent. Read her dissent and her justification for allowing these gruesome type of abortions. It's crazy. But anyway, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, she's actually publicly said that Roe went too far and is on shaky footing. She actually said that. She said that just a couple months before she was confirmed by the Supreme Court. She believed that, the court should have just struck down the Texas law against abortions and should not have gone further. And had the court been, I guess, more piecemeal in their support for abortion, that it wouldn't have caused the level of backlash that we have today. The fact that we, 46 years after Roe versus Wade, have this entire movement that's still growing, that we haven't sat down and shut up. There's not many cases, Supreme Court cases, that have kind of created this type of social justice movement. You think about slavery and civil rights and abortion, that there's been a long-standing fight, division, really a tear in the fabric of a nation because of the Supreme Court poorly deciding this. So yeah, Roe versus Wade was just poorly decided. Even notable pro-abortion folks, pro-choicers, agree with this fact. It's just not constitutional law. It's not constitutional law. The attorneys for Roe were so desperate when they were trying to, a couple years ago, the private correspondence between the justices from the 1970s was publicly released. And it's fascinating if you read some of their correspondence, and also very scary how they kind of like, well, you need to come over on my case here, Roe, and then I'll come over on your case over here. How they kind of bargain with each other. But the attorneys for Roe were actually, they were so desperate. They at one time even considered trying to use the Third Amendment to justify abortion on demand. The Third Amendment, which prohibits the military from forcing citizens to house soldiers, they were thinking about using that. It was bad. Ultimately, if you've ever read the Roe decision, they rely on Griswold v. Connecticut, which was a decision handed down in 1965, which said that, established this right to privacy. They said that there was a right to privacy in the 14th Amendment, derived from the liberty cause. Life, liberty. So they believe that rights to privacy in the home is derived from the liberty cause. Griswold, it was a decision that said that married couples had the right to use contraception because they had this right to privacy in their home. But that right to privacy isn't actually in the Constitution. This is what came up from Griswold. This is why a lot of times when we talk about law, about abortion, contraception always kind of comes up. And I've heard sometimes they're like, don't ever talk about contraception. We should always keep it separate. And there's differing views in contraception. But really, we have abortion because of contraception. And I'm going to say this over and over again, and I know it's going to piss some people off, but that's actually true. We have abortion because we have contraception. We can see it right there in the Supreme Court. 1970 1873, Roe was decided because of Griswold, because this right to contraception, this right to privacy that was made up from the 14th Amendment. That's why we have Roe. And honestly, we have a push for abortion because of contraception, right? And we've talked about, I've talked to you all about that before, that once sex was fundamentally changed, and this is the thing, like I've said over and over again, this like blows people's minds, so maybe we should say it a little bit more. Once sex was fundamentally changed from, something that two people who've committed to spend their lives together to create a family, once it was no longer for that, it was just for sexual pleasure, just for fun, and contraception was given to folks. So you could totally separate the fact that, a very natural consequence of having intercourse, heterosexual intercourse, is creating a new human life. Once you were able to say, well, look, that doesn't have to be a consequence of abortion, having sex anymore. Abortion had to be presented because contraception isn't foolproof. That there's a 9% annual failure rate for a birth control user, 18% annual failure rate for a condom user. Birth control is going to fail. All of us know somebody who was on the pill who became pregnant. We all know somebody who became pregnant. That proves right there that there's breakthrough ovulation occurring when a woman's taking hormonal birth control. Because if you all remember, hormonal birth control is supposed to stop the release of the egg from the ovary, and it doesn't all the time. And so once you did that, you had to present abortion to be that final solution to take care of the oops, because no one was like, what? I'm pregnant? I had sex? Shock. And that's still, like I said, on college campuses, it's shocking if you don't envision yourself having a baby with that man, maybe you shouldn't have sex with them. Maybe that's just a thought that needs to run through your head before you hook up with somebody. Okay. So if you want to read more about Roe and how it was decided and kind of the backroom dealings that happened at the Supreme Court when these 7 men decided to make the law of the land for everyone, read Abuse of Discretion by Clark Forsythe. Clark is probably the preeminent pro-life legal scholar on Roe. He works for a group called Americans United for Life. He literally will just says what happened, and he'll tear apart every justification that was used in Roe. He actually wrote a mock opinion for how the Supreme Court could reverse itself on Roe. It's called A Draft Opinion Overturning Roe versus Wade. It's an academic journal article. You should look that up, Google that, A Draft Opinion Overturning Roe versus Wade, and you can actually read his opinion for how, how the court can go about legally overturning itself. I would highly encourage you to do that. Look up these letters. Look up the personal correspondence between the Supreme Court justices at the time they were deciding Roe. What's interesting, a few years ago, I was at an event, sat next to a couple, and we started talking about what I do and where they're from, and they're from Minnesota. Harry Blackman was from Minnesota, and we were talking about Minnesota, and she said, "Yeah, my family, when I was growing up, we were family friends of the Blackmans," and she told me about Harry Blackman's daughter, and she said, if you really want to know about Roe versus Wade, you need to look into Blackman's personal life. 1966, his daughter's in college, becomes pregnant, out of wedlock. There is a shotgun wedding. The marriage only lasts 6 years, and she talked about how the marriage was a disaster. There was abuse that went on, and Blackman, being an angry father, was angry that his daughter's whole future was changed because she had this out of wedlock pregnancy, that she married this really terrible guy. And so that really got me thinking, like, wow, when Supreme Court justices make decisions on cases, they're supposed to be fair and impartial, but there's always personal bias that comes into the thinking. Most justices, you see this all the time. And even Supreme Court justices, they're not immune to whatever's going on in their family. And once I heard that, I was like, wow, that kind of makes sense for why Harry Blackman was so willing to draft Roe versus Wade, knowing it had no constitutional standing whatsoever. And he was just willing to go along with it because he had a personal stake. He had a personal story. It's Roe versus Wade. It doesn't rest on any constitutional law. So when you hear, these Democratic candidates for president talk about Roe versus Wade is constitutional law. It's not constitutional law. The best standing that pro-aborts have right now on Roe is that it's precedent. That's the best standing they have because, as you all know, the Supreme Court hates to reverse itself. Why? Because if the Supreme Court reverses itself, it basically has to admit it's wrong. Just like any other human being hating to admit they're wrong, the Supreme Court really hates to admit they're wrong. They think it hurts the honor and the prestige of the court. So, they've only, like I said earlier, they've only reversed themselves 236 times. That's less than 2% of all of their decisions they've handed down in their 229 years. But they have done it before. They've overturned the Plessy decision in Brown versus Board of Education. They overturned the Dred Scott decision. It can happen, but they do hate to do it. And that's why I don't know if you all remember, I was working the Republican National Committee at the time when Justice Alito was being confirmed. And at the RNC, everybody gets like their own TV everywhere. And I was watching the hearings, and I was low man on the totem pole, so everyone was gone. So I was like just watching the hearings like all day long. And Alito, I remember Arlen Specter. He was a senator from Pennsylvania. He was a Republican. He was pro-abortion. He later became Democrat, which isn't surprising. I have a story with him. He actually pushed me into the bushes in front of the Capitol Hill Club one time. He was walking by so fast and couldn't be bothered to move out of the way. But Arlen Specter kept grilling Justice Alito on this term, super duper precedent. It's very legal sounding. Super duper precedent. Won't you agree that super duper? And he kept trying to press Alito on Roe, and Alito did a really good job in answering his questions. But yeah, so Roe was poorly decided. It's not any constitutional law. It's, the best defense that they have, that the liberal pro-aborts have right now, is that it's super duper precedent, but it can be done. Roe versus Wade can be reversed. It can go back to the states. I was reading a Vox article this morning. Vox is very pro-abortion. And a lot of pro-choicers are saying, you know what, just let Roe be reversed. It'll take the wind out of the pro-life movement's sails. It'll go back to the states. Most states are going to allow abortion in some form or the other. It's not going to be as bad as we think. Plus, it should quiet everybody down, because really that's what they want. They want to quiet everyone down. There's been, a lot of journalists and kind of scholars saying, if only the American abortion movement would moderate itself and make America's laws on abortion more like Europe's laws on abortion, there wouldn't be a pro-life movement. Because sadly, the pro-life movement's very small in Europe. Students for Life has been lucky to work with several partner organizations in Europe, but it's actually really hard. It's hard to get a conversation about abortion started. The churches won't talk about it. They have nothing like what we have here in America. And so the argument from the abortion movement is if we can moderate our abortion laws, we know that the majority of abortions are happening in the first trimester. So if you offer abortions just in the first trimester, or maybe just a little bit into the second trimester, the pro-life movement isn't going to have an argument, because they focus all the time on these late-term abortions. This is why we've been arguing, Students for Life has been arguing, like, we need to be talking about first trimester abortions, these RU486 abortions, because we see where the abortion movement is going. We see where they're headed. And we have to make sure that when Roe is reversed, when the decision of abortion goes back to states, and we have 50 state battles, this is what we've been preparing at Students for Life for, because we're a post-Roe organization, that we have to have 50 simultaneous battles. And we're going to be the only group that has trained activists in all the states ready to go. But we as a movement have to be prepared for that day, right? We have to know what are the resources that she's going to need. How are we going to advertise those resources so no woman feels desperate enough to travel 4 states to get her abortion? What else do we need to pass in the state? Like, I don't know, like adoption tax credits, because if it's costing $30,000 to $50,000 to adopt a baby, that's a problem. That should be a tax credit, right? Some states it's only $5,000 or something like that. And there's a lot we need to do. For example, if adoptions are costing $30,000 to $50,000 a year, maybe we should offer more than just a $5,000 tax credit for couples who adopt, for families who adopt. So there's laws that we need to have prepared to have in place. There's resources that we need or we need to better market. And there's activists that we're going to have on the ground. But we're going to be ready for it. And the pro-life movement needs to keep working towards it. And we need to make sure that we keep that same level of outrage at abortion once Roe's reversed. We won't have just this one target, right? We're going to have 50 statewide targets. And that's why we need to continue to talk about what's our long-term plan in the pro-life movement. The ultimate goal is not just to reverse Roe. And sometimes I hear people say reverse Roe or overturn Roe. We can say that, but our goal is much bigger than that. That's step one, right? Phase one of our plan. It's to reverse Roe. It's to go back to the states to, make abortion illegal in multiple states, to work towards having 38 state legislatures to be pro-life. And then it's going to go to be passed a human life amendment to actually firmly put in our Constitution that the child in the womb is a recognized citizen that has the same rights as you and I, that child is a human person with rights. But at the end of the day, no matter what you hear this election cycle about Roe versus Wade, about being constitutional right, or whatever lies they're trying to tell you, just to remember, a handful of judges cannot erase the morality of the issue. That ending lives of people in the womb, that is our human rights issue of our day. And 7 judges in the Supreme Court cannot erase their personhood. Thanks, guys, for tuning in. I hope you'll join me next week on Explicitly Pro-Life. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure you subscribe and spread the word. Thanks.